Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to talk about adding texture to a design for 3D printing. Now, we've already talked about the Mesh Extrude tool in Fusion, and there are a couple of different slicers that have texturing options, so I would suggest doing a bit of research before diving into this manual workflow that we're going to talk about today. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at how to apply this carbon fiber texture like we did in Fusion, but we're going to do it in Blender. Now we'll look at a basic example of a cube. We're going to deform it a little bit. And then we're going to talk about exporting your CAD designs and actually doing this inside of Blender for things that you export. So in this case, what we have is we're going to be using a Displacement Modifier. We're going to add the carbon fiber texture to an exported design from Fusion. And we'll also talk a little bit about how we can create a smooth bottom and a smooth inside. So obviously we don't want the texture everywhere when we're 3D printing. We probably don't need it on the inside of the object. So I'll talk about some tips on how to make that happen. So the first thing to note is getting a texture itself. So this one was pulled directly from the bump maps available in Fusion. So if you did follow along with that mesh texture that we used before, then you can go ahead and dive into Fusion and find that. You can also use some of the different add-ons for Blender. So there are some benefits in Blender with the ability to actually use things like polygon add-on and do texture brushing. So this is a little bit different than what we're going to be talking about today, but this allows you to go into the sculpting environment and use a brush and drag it over to add a texture. So that can be a really helpful workflow, especially if you just want to add it to a certain area. There are other programs. Formlabs has released a different workflow where you can export a surface, add texture to it, and then bring it back into Fusion. There are also some slicers, that will do this as well. I think Idea Station may be one of them. I haven't personally used it, so I can't really comment on it, but I do know that that functionality is available. So I know this kind of looks like a carbon fiber loaf of bread, but I wanted to use it because one of the big problems we have with the mesh extrude texture thing is that it just kind of deforms it as it wraps around the sides of things because it's basically planar. So how do we deal with that? How do we work with exports and how do we make it so that we have a smooth bottom and a smooth inside? So first, let's get started. I'm using Blender 4.5. You can use probably pretty much any version of Blender that you want, but make sure that you are at least in the most somewhat recent version if you're worried about finding access to the tools. Now, there have been plenty of releases of Blender over the past probably 5 years, and the UI is very similar, so you probably won't have trouble if you've got an old install. But again, I'm on 4.5. We don't need the camera. I'm going to select it and hit delete. We don't need the light. Select it and hit delete. All we really are going to do is start with this cube. Now, the first thing that we should understand is the process we're using is to use what's called a modifier. Now, modifiers can be found in this wrench icon here, and there are different types of modifiers. So for example, generate allows us to do things like divide the polygons up into smaller polygons. The deform section is where we're going to go to use a displace modifier. This can be done by using a displacement texture image, and it'll basically take all those, the black and the white, sort of the grayscale image, and raise or lower areas of the mesh. Now, the big thing we need to understand about this is in order to do this, your mesh element sizes, whether they're quads or tris, need to be small enough to capture the detail you're trying to add. So when we look at an image like we have here, there is a lot going on with these gray bands that give us the appearance of a true carbon fiber fabric. Now, this image is made so that it can be tiled, so you can use it over and over again. But in order to capture this, we're going to need a lot of really small triangles. Now, if you have a more simplified version of an image you want to use, that will probably be better. But I wanted to go to this extreme because I've gotten this question about creating a carbon fiber appearance on objects before, so I wanted to use that as our example. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to go from object mode into edit mode. If you're familiar with Blender, you can use the shortcuts tab on the keyboard, and tab will let you go in and out of edit mode. We just simply have 6 quads, basically 6 sides of this cube. Now we can manipulate those by selecting vertices and moving them, for example. We can change to face selection, and we can use scale, and we can scale this down or up. And basically, what we want to understand is that if we try to apply a texture to this, we do not have the resolution to make that happen. Now, if we go out of edit mode and into object mode, and we start with our modifiers, again, the wrench icon here, and we go to generate and subdivision surface, what we're going to do is we're going to take every one of those 6 faces, and for one in the levels viewport, which is basically the viewport where we're making edits, it's going to divide that one face up into 4 smaller faces. If we change this to 2, it'll take each of those 4 smaller faces and divide those up. And as we keep doing this, keep going and going, you can also do this in the render environment. So if you're going to be doing rendered images, for example, then you want to make sure you identify that those are different. Now, the problem with this is when we use this subdivision surface on a model like this cube that we have, it's going to divide up basically the cage that we've created and smooth it out till we get this sort of sphere egg shape. Now, if we go back into edit mode, it's still the same thing. We still have this face here. We can still do things like scale it up and down and change its shape. But in order for us to get it to a situation where we can apply that texture, we have to subdivide it, or we have to make those mesh elements smaller. Now, the problem is with these types of models is we need to add some sort of control to make sure that we keep those sharp edges. Now, a couple ways that we can do this. First thing I'm going to do is turn on X-ray mode, which lets me see through and grab everything. I'm going to go to my edges, and I'm going to box select all the edges. Now, when I do that, I want to expand this little panel here by left clicking. You can also use N on the keyboard, and then I'm going to add a crease. So when I add the crease, I'm going to turn off X-ray mode, and I'm going to go back to object mode. So now with the crease, basically what we've done is we've taken it back to that sort of cube shape, but we've divided it up. So now that we've got all of those basically smaller sections, you can come in and you can apply the subdivision modifier. If you're sure that you don't want to change it, we can apply it. And now if we go into edit mode, you'll notice we have this division. Now at this point, I'm going to go back to X-ray, edge selection, select all the edges, set this mean crease back to 0. It's 0.065 because now it has all of our edges selected. If we set it to 0 and go back to object mode and turn off X-ray, it now has a little bit of a softer edge, but because it has so many divisions, it is now able to actually create that. So as sort of a general sense, I don't recommend applying the modifiers like this unless you absolutely have to, but it does help because it allows us to get sort of that deeper level of divisions. This is not going to be enough divisions, I can already tell you just from the start. So we likely need to do another subdivision modifier in order to make this one work. So I'm going to go ahead and divide this up 3 more times, and then we're going to move on to the displacement. So the next thing that we want to do is now we want to add our displacement modifier, which is going to let us use that image to create that carbon fiber texture. So under Add Modifiers, under Deform, go to Displace. Now instantly what happens is it just displaces everything we have selected and it just kind of pushes it out. Now you can move this in and out and you can kind of change and see what's going on. And this is basically like you're scaling the whole thing up, but we're not actually changing the geometry. If we go back into edit mode, for example, it's still the original thing underneath it, and object mode is just applying this modifier. Now these modifiers can be applied, so you could use this drop down and apply it, which will change the overall geometry. But again, we don't want to do that right now. The next thing that we want to do is we want to say, okay, well, we don't just want to change the normal displacement of what we have, we want to change it using an image. So here we've got this new option, and next to it we've got textures. So if you already have a texture in your design, you can use the drop down. If you don't, then what we're going to do is we're going to select new. Now that it's using the texture, things go a bit crazy, but that's okay, we're going to fix that. Once we have texture selected, use this little option on the right, which will show the texture in the texture tab. This will show the selected one, and basically it's just going to navigate us to here. That's all it does. With this texture, we now want to add an image to it. So under settings, we're going to select open, and we're going to navigate to the location where you've got an image saved. So for me, it's just in the sandbox under bump maps, and I'm going to add that carbon fiber image. Again, don't worry too much. It's just looking a bit crazy right now. Once we have that image added, we're going to go back to our modifier. we're going to go and modify the strength and pull it down. Now, the first thing you may notice is that it looks good on the top, but as it goes down the sides, it's stretching. You may think, Matt, you told us that was the whole reason that we didn't use the Fusion Mesh Extrude. And it's true, but we need to do a little bit more work, unfortunately, to make this work. So the next thing we need to do is change the coordinates of how this image texture is being wrapped to our object. And the best way to do that is by using a UV wrap. When we do that, we instantly get a very large version of this because it's going to be based on the image size that we have used for our texture. Now, two ways for us to fix that. One is to go back to the texture, and down here under mapping, we've got this option for repeating. So if we increase the repeats, I'm going to go ahead and do this in both directions. You can see it's starting to basically tile this image for us and make it smaller and smaller. So that's one way to do it, and this is the way that I would suggest or recommend. And you'll notice it actually looks pretty good. Like we do have the fabric weaved over the edges and corners, and it's stretching. It's kind of shrinking on top and stretching on the bottom. Now, this is because by default, this object is automatically UV unwrapped. So if we're in UV editing, hit A on the keyboard to select all. This is the default UV unwrap. So it already knows that it's essentially dealing with an unwrapped cube, even though we've deformed it slightly. If you want to modify this inside of the UV editing, what we can do is we can open our image in here, and I'm going to go ahead and again navigate to the location, and we can put our image here. Now the problem with this, I'm going to go back to layout for a second, and I'm going to turn the repeats back to 1. The problem with this in UV editing is the scale, right? The scale is off, and because we don't have that repeat option, it's going to display it as just a huge thing. So we're going to select everything. We're going to use scale. I'm going to zoom out to make this happen. And I'm going to scale this up until the carbon fiber texture is about the size that I want it. So it looks pretty good. I'm going to go back to layout, and you can see that it's resized it based on the scale of our UV mapping relative to that image. So these are two ways that we can make this happen. Both essentially have the same outcome. I would suggest using the repeats, especially as you're just getting started. It's going to be much easier than worrying about the UV unwrap because a lot of these objects automatically UV unwrap. Now, this can get a little tricky once we start to import objects, but that's the basic process. All right. So now we're going to hide this, and we're going to talk about importing something from Fusion. So I'm going to hop back to Fusion, and go ahead and take a look at this sort of funky bread loaf shape. So this is just a freeform model that I am going to use to apply that carbon fiber texture to. A couple of things that I would suggest before you ever send this out to Blender is keep in mind that if we want to get a smooth bottom and a smooth inside, and we don't want to apply that carbon fiber texture to it, we have to send out, or we should send out, an extra model. It's much easier, at least I found it's much easier to do this with the geometry in Fusion than it is to work with it in Blender if you're not a sort of seasoned Blender user and you're not familiar with the controls. So my suggestion is to go to your Surface tab. I'm going to do an offset of the inside and say OK. And then I'm going to go ahead and patch the bottom, say OK. And then under bodies, we're going to stitch these two together. What this allows us to do is have an inside body here. So I'm going to go ahead and call this inside, and I'm going to call this one outside. Now, the reason this is important is because we have the ability to do Boolean operations in Blender where we can subtract one mesh body from another. So having the inside, or the smooth version that we want, even if we end up having to scale it up a little bit, that we can use to cut away the texture we add, is going to allow us to add those in the modifier stack after we add that displace modifier. Now, if you send them both as one thing because they're exactly touching, Blender won't be able to automatically separate them by loose parts, meaning they're not touching. So what I would suggest is export them independently or individually. So inside, we're going to go to Save as Mesh. I'm going to export it as an STL. It's going to get converted to a triangle anyways, just kind of how Fusion does it. And then we'll do the same thing for the outside. Now, theoretically, I haven't done this yet, but theoretically, they should be in the exact same location. So go back to Blender, File, import STL. I'm going to do the outside first, and then I'm going to do file, import STL. I'm going to do the inside, and they should be in the exact right location. So if we hide the outside, bring it back, you can see they're in the same location. So the inside is the one we're going to use to cut things away. The outside for right now is going to be the one that we apply the texture to. So I'm going to hit A to select all. I want both of those pieces, and I'm going to move them vertically because I want them to be above that bottom, just because I don't want to see it through the grid and I don't want to turn it off. So I'm going to hide the inside. I'm going to go into my edit mode to just take a look at the resolution we have. We may find that we want to do a bit of work, either remeshing or doing a subdivision, but honestly, when they come in triangles like this, it gets a bit messy. Probably your best bet is to do a fine refinement when you export this and then kind of deal with the consequences afterwards. This is not a mesh that you would want to modify directly in Blender, but it might work for what we're doing. All right, so now that we have this, again in the modifiers, we're going to go to our deform modifier, displace, and here we've already got a texture, so I'm just going to use the same one in this file, but we could go through the exact same process of adding it, and then play around with the settings. Now you'll notice that because of the triangular mesh that we're dealing with, it doesn't look great. So what we can do is we can try, and I will give you a fair warning that this could crash your computer, but if you try to subdivide this model, it's going to be very processor heavy. So just be careful. Now that I've warned you, I'm going to go ahead and do it and hopefully don't crash things. I'm going to drag this before the displace. I'm going to let it update. It's thinking. And now you can see we got a bit more resolution to this. Of course, on the displace, we need to use UV. When we do that, it doesn't change like the cube because unlike the cube, this imported model isn't automatically UV unwrapped. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and do our UV unwrapping. Otherwise, we're going to get it stretching on the side here. So we're going to go UV editing tab. We are going to hit A to select all. And then there's a UV menu. You can also hit U on the keyboard. And we're going to do a smart UV project. We're going to unwrap it. It's going to take a second based on, again, all these triangles. It's not going to be happy with me. And you can see there the scale is way off, but that's okay. I'm going to go back to layout. It's thinking. Again, when you subdivide a mesh like this, it gets pretty nasty. Now we'll go to our texture and we'll go to mapping and we'll start increasing these repeats. Keep in mind that we're reusing this texture, which means it's going to modify the cube as well, but I don't care because I'm not actually using the cube. But what you can see is as we increase these repeats, the size of the image is getting smaller and smaller, and it's tiling it. And eventually you're going to get to the point where it is going to be the size that you want for your object. So if you're trying to 3D print a carbon fiber texture onto something, this is a way that you can do it. Keep in mind, this is applying to the inside, the bottom, and the outside. So again, a carbon fiber sort of loaf of bread. The way that we get around this is I'm going to bring the inside back. I'm going to select the outside, go to my modifiers, and I'm going to add a Boolean modifier from generate. So from the Boolean modifier, I'm going to do a difference. The object that we want to use is going to be the inside object. It's going to take a little bit for it to calculate, so we're just going to let it happen. Again, when we import meshes that were converted from CAD models and we do things like subdivide them or add displacement modifiers, they don't work nearly as nice as they do as original models that are created in Blender, things that have good topology. So just keep in mind that there is going to be a limit based on your computer, the way that your computer's set up, the processing of it, and if it crashes, it's not my fault. I'll put it that way. All right, so now if I hide the inside, you can see that the inside has removed that carbon fiber texture, but because the areas that were lower, you can actually see what's happened is those are still there. It's got the kind of like weird texture to it. So what you could do is you could scale up the inside, or you could scale down the inside of this part before you do the subtraction. Now the bottom didn't get subtracted because we didn't actually have anything there. So the easy way to do that is add mesh cube. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this up. So I want to scale it, but I want to scale it in plane, so in XY. You may need to zoom out, scale it in XY, and then I'm going to go to a front view, like a Y view, and then we're going to go to move, and we're going to move it down, and we want to move it just up enough so that we can cut away from that object. And then again, add another modifier, generate Boolean. This time we're dealing with fairly simple geometry, so we just have a cube. But again, the more we do this, the harder it's going to be on the processor because we're asking a lot, because these are not ideal mesh models. So just keep in mind, if you're doing this, especially if the texture you're using is pretty complex, then you could run into some of these performance issues. What I will say is you can create all of these operations and go back after the fact and do the displace and put it in its sort of orientation. I'm going to go to Object. This is a cube we just created, cube 001. We're going to allow it to think. All right, so then if we hide the new cube we created, we rotate this around, you should see the bottom is nice and smooth. So if we want to, we can hide the floor, and you can see that's nice and smooth there. All right, so then the next step that you would do is with just this one visible, we can go to export. We can export an STL. I'll stick it in the same location, and I'm going to call this a carbon loaf because basically it's a carbon fiber bread loaf. The big thing here is you want to select the apply modifiers. So even though we didn't bake that into the mesh, we did tell it to apply those modifiers when it was creating that STL. So if we go into something like Bamboo Studio or whatever slicer you're using, you should now be able to bring in that STL, and it should have the carbon fiber texture on the outside. You should have a smooth bottom, and you should have a fairly smooth inside. Again, that's going to be dependent on the texture you're adding, this basically the size of everything. So I'm going to go ahead and insert this. Let's go to the location, carbon loaf. Might be too big. I don't know. I didn't really pay attention to the size. Okay, that's okay. All right, so you can see here, it is smooth on the bottom, so it sits on the build plate just fine. And we have that carbon fiber texture that was added to the outside. So there you go. I know this process took a little bit of time, but just make sure that we understand that it is possible that we can create a model in Fusion, we can export it as a mesh, we can then bring it into Blender, apply an image as a texture to something that is non-planar, and then we can export it as a mesh file that we can use for 3D printing. Again, if you are going to be doing this, I would suggest you do a little bit of research and search around for the Formlabs option that's available, as well as other 3D print slicers that you can use that do have these options. What I have found is that most 3D print slicers just have a fuzzy skin option and don't actually have a true texture option where you can use an image. So if you have to go the route of doing this manually, that's the way that you can do it with an image. And again, I would also suggest doing a little bit of digging into add-ons like the Polygon add-on. There are also plenty of different websites and add-ons for Blender that have free bump map images or free grayscale images that you can use. In Blender, you can also use sculpting tools. So some of these add-ons like Polygon will have sculpting tools that you can use and just basically drag the brush across your model and create that texture in that sense as well. The same things will apply. The mesh resolution, basically the size of those triangles or quads, is going to have a direct impact on the quality or the detail that you can get out of doing something like this. Now, I did play around with this technique on the front fender that we created for the GPZ build series, which I do still have to get back to, just have kind of been on the bottom of my list. So I have tried this to do it on larger models. And again, the performance is not great when you have a CAD model that's converted. It definitely works a lot better and more efficiently if you create the model in Blender as a true quad model. But if you bring in a triangular mesh, just keep in mind that there is going to be a performance hangup. But again, if you have any questions on this process, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.